I am Hannah McGregor. My pronouns are she, her. I'm going to be chairing this session. And I will set out a few sort of terms of engagement in a moment. I'm going to be actively petting a cat off screen this whole time. If you're really lucky, I might bring them on screen at some point. I want to begin by recognizing that I'm coming to you from what is currently known as Vancouver, which is the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am trying to make a point on Zoom meetings of inviting folks for whom territory acknowledgements are part of your practice to share those in the chat as well. So I know that folks are coming from all over the world, and so that may be more or less appropriate depending on where you're coming from, but please do share what territory you're Zooming in from if that applies to you. I am delighted to be chairing this session. Here is what I hope we're going to do. I hope we are going to chat for like 30 minutes. I sort of have a set of questions that I have shared already with the participants, but I'm really excited also about opening things up for the folks who are here. So go ahead and use the chat function to, talk to each other, talk to us. I'm pretty good at keeping one eye on the chat as we talk. Other panelists, please feel free to close the chat and not pay any attention if you find it distracting. But then I formally at some point, I will sort of open things up and invite other folks to also add in questions or add perspectives. We have live captioning enabled. So if you would like to have the live transcript, you can activate that on the bottom of your own Zoom screen. I think you should also be able to change your own name if you would like to do so. So if you do want to add in pronouns or anything else like that, you can go ahead and do that on your own name. And you probably already know this because you heard the nice Zoom lady say it, but we are being recorded. So if you are not comfortable being recorded, you can just keep your camera off. And of course, you can also change your name on Zoom if that is something you would like to do. So shall we get started, folks? Great, amazing. So I am going to, I'm actually just like the veteran podcast host that I am, I'm just gonna ask people to introduce themselves because I love making other people introduce themselves. So I'm gonna start off by asking our other panelists to tell us briefly who they are and where they're coming from and what their podcasting experience is. And we're gonna start off with Milan Terlunen, who is running this Zoom room while also being on this panel.
Thanks, Hannah. So my name's Milan Terlunen. I am a PhD candidate in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Since 2016, I've been the host and creator of the How to Read podcast, which is like 15-minute bite-sized conversations between me and a different scholar or thinker each time, aimed at listeners with no prior knowledge, no specific academic training. More recently, I've also been training students and faculty and staff at Columbia in podcasting. And I am also this year, I got a grant from Humanities New York to do a kind of innovative project that involves podcasting, but also kind of like location-specific audio. So it's to do with the churches of Harlem and their histories of feminist, queer, and anti-racist activism. And then it's also going to have a kind of like interactive asynchronous element where participants can walk the same route that me and the guest did and contribute their own stories and theological reflection. So that's all still work in progress, but yeah, I think that gives you a sense of who I am and what I do.
That is really exciting. I love the idea of site-specific audio like that and sort of interactive, responsive audio. Thank you, Milan. Next up, Merle Eisenberg.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me here today. I'm a assistant professor of history at Oklahoma State University, And I'm by training a late ancient and medieval historian. So for all of you out there, that means I work on roughly 300 to 1,000 CE on a whole bunch of other topics. But before COVID, actually, I became kind of a side hobby of an interest in histories of disease and pandemics way back in 2018, not knowing what was to come, obviously. And basically how I got into this was in what I like to refer to as the long march of 2020. My colleague and co-host Lee Mordecai, we decided we wanted to do something given our own knowledge on diseases and pandemics. So we started a podcast called The Infectious Historians, where we, for the most part, bring on guests, interview them about different time periods and their work, as well as what's become in retrospect something of an oral history of our own experiences during COVID, since we always have a little banter to start about what's happening. And as I joke, my kids will listen to this in 20 years and probably be horrified that I'm just talking about their misbehavior. So that's kind of me, and I'm happy to talk more once we get into it.
Amazing, thank you, Merle. Next up, Katherine McLeod.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine McLeod, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm tuning in today from Montreal, Canada, or what is known as Tiohtià:ke. Tiohtià:ke is the name for this place in the language of the Kanakahaga people, who are the recognized custodians of these lands and waters. Right now, I can't see the water. I'm looking out onto a tree-lined street, but this place is very connected to the rivers that meet here and form what is known as the St. Lawrence River. And it's here at this desk that I've quite literally been, this is where I've been making the series called Shortcuts that airs on the Spoken Web podcast feed. I produce the series Shortcuts. It airs monthly as a short mini-sode as part of the Spoken Web podcast. We'll hear more about the Spoken Web podcast as we go. Spoiler alert, Hannah McGregor is the host of the Spoken Web podcast. So she will also be talking a little bit about that, I'm sure. Shortcuts itself are deep dives into the archives. I think of them as a way to listen closely and carefully to archival recordings, and also think about what you can do with podcasts as a form of criticism, which is why I'm here talking on this panel. Just a short story of how I came to this is that I continue to be researching Canadian women poets who read on the CBC radio at some point, especially in the 60s. And that got me really interested in radio archives. I'm just starting a big project that is thinking about collecting data around poets who read on the radio in Canada at some point and how we can compile that data. And I'm writing a book about Canadian women poets on CBC radio. So doing a lot of research on radio, and then started to think of how I could actually make something that is as close to radio as possible in the form of this podcast, Shortcuts.
Awesome, thank you, Katherine. And last up we have Sadie Ryan.
Hello, so I'm Sadie Ryan. I'm a Zoomin from Glasgow in Scotland. And I make a podcast called Accentricity, which is about language and identity, and it is very much aimed at a non-specialist audience. I basically started making it because, so my day job is working as a sociolinguist, but I got bored about talking to other linguists about language. So I wanted to talk to some people who weren't linguists about how they experience language. And I guess what I've always been trying to do is like bring together academic and non-academic knowledge about language, if you can make that distinction, and kind of tie in linguistic theory with how people think and talk and feel about their speech, which I think there's often quite a big gap between those things. So I started making the podcast as a way to speak to people about language, but recently I've been doing a lot more collaborative work and thinking about ways to use podcasting as a tool for doing participatory research. So I've just been working on a grant proposal, which would be using podcasting with a group of young people who've moved to Glasgow and some of their peers who've grown up in Glasgow to kind of talk about multilingualism and identity and class and other topics like that, and so together we would be making a podcast series about this subject, and through doing that, the hope is that I would learn as an academic, and I would be writing a book based on the experiences, but also the podcast series we made would become part of the public communication of the research. So kind of finding ways to hopefully include their voices in the research outputs in a very real way. And then hopefully they also get to have some fun, because research I've done with young people in the past, I think, has been, just not that exciting for them. So the idea is that they get a good experience and they learn skills and they develop their confidence in their voices and these sort of things. So that's the main scholarly podcasting thing I'm working on just now.
Amazing. Thank you, Sadie. And because I'm bad at reading my own list of participants I have right here in front of me, Sadie is not last up. Last up is Emanuele Fantini.
Thank you, Anna, and nice to be here. I was particularly interested also in listening to Katherine connection to the river, because I'm senior lecturer and researcher at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands. I come from Italy, but I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm connected to another river, which is the Nile River. And the podcast that I've been hosting is called The Sources of the Nile, and explores the role of media and science communication in conflict and cooperation over the Nile River. There was a podcast that we did in an action research project, also involving journalists and researchers from different countries a few years ago. And after that, we were asked to contribute to a journal, which is a water studies journal called Water Alternatives, and to host a podcast that introduce and present special issues of the journal with editors and authors. And more recently, I also started a podcast, this time in Italian, that was a way to reconnect not only to my friends, colleagues back home, but also to reconnect to research that I did 10 years ago when there was a bigger referendum against the privatization of water services in Italy. And because of this, of that referendum, after everything was becoming a common school, all mobilizations were framed as common. So the podcast asked the question, where have all the commons gone 10 years after the referendum? So it's a kind of anniversary podcast, but also it's a way to reconnect with people, with research, and also to use the podcast itself as a research to generate new data. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're already really sort of getting towards some of the exciting overlaps between the different work people are doing. I will briefly say I do, as Katherine said, host the Spoken Web podcast, which is one arm of the larger Spoken Web project, which is a research project here in Canada focused on the study of archival sound. So that is very fun, like using podcasting as an opportunity primarily to let scholars experiment with sound-based scholarship on their sound-based archives. So we can absolutely talk about that more, about sort of podcasting as a sandbox is kind of how we think about it a lot of the time. I also make Witch Please, which is a feminist rereading of the Harry Potter series. We rebooted that last year. It was originally 2015 to 2018, and we rebooted it last year with a network. And somehow it's Patreon supported, but is also 100% just like a Theory 101 class. It's just using Harry Potter to introduce people to like structuralism and how it works. And I used to host Secret Feminist Agenda, which was an interview podcast, not unlike the one that Milan has described, sort of talking to various experts, but with a focus on experts in feminism. Who are often not academics, of course. And that was the pilot project for the Amplify Podcast Network, which is a scholarly podcast network that I am organizing with Wilfrid Laurier University Press, where we are experimenting with having a network of peer-reviewed podcasts. So I do a lot of podcasting these days, and I'm really excited to talk with all of you about your podcasting. And the question I wanted to start us off with is how becoming a podcaster has transformed your relationship to the scholarship that you do. And we've already got a few hints. I mean, I saw everybody sort of laugh and nod when Sadie said that you started making a podcast because you were bored of talking to other people in your particular niche. And I suspect fun and the desire to talk to anyone else is often a motivation for us getting started. But yeah, I would love to hear from folks about what sort of revelations you've had about your relationship to your scholarship via your podcasting work. Does somebody want to jump in, or do you want me to call on you like a school teacher? Because I will, and I will make Milan talk first if we're called. Sadie, I saw you unmute yourself. Go.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in if no one else wants to. Yeah, so I'm kind of half joking but half deadly serious about getting bored of talking to other linguists about language. I think that for me, I don't know if this is a thing across lots of different disciplines or if it's just mine, but I think sometimes we do get a bit just calcified in our ideas and kind of stuck in kind of dogma of this is how language works, this is how people experience language. And then I just had noticed that when I was kind of reading and learning the same things again and again, and then when I spoke to people at parties about language, I was hearing completely different things. So like, I think that speaking out from your field is really important, but also listening is really important. Particularly, yeah, I don't know if this is something that exists across fields, and maybe people can tell me if it does or not. But yeah, I think that for me, making Accent Interested has definitely made me a better listener as an academic. And yeah, I just find that when I speak to people who have no linguistic training and haven't necessarily thought about language and identity before, they quite often challenge the things that I might have learned in class or read in books. And that's been really, really valuable for me. I think it's made me value non-academic knowledge more. And I mean, the other obvious thing it's done is just to make me more confident and kind of help me find my voice as an academic. Where, yeah, I think that's been, and yeah, it's brought a lot of joy back into my research. I started doing it when I was kind of towards the end of finishing my PhD, and it did really bring the joy back in. Some lots of good things for me.
Yeah. I mean, that point about listening and having conversations with folks who are not academics about their relationship to language, I think gets at something that's really key to how podcasting can shift what we do, which is that it expands the locus of how we think about expertise. That the sort of sense of like expertise belongs to people who are within these institutions is something that has like this long colonial history, right? That like sort of we do research on and about communities, but not in dialogue and with communities. And that when you want to start shifting where and how you do your research so that it is in dialogue with people, so that it is sort of breaking outside of the ossified walls of the university, podcasting is so well suited to that. It's a medium people understand. It doesn't require people to go through the weird gateways of scholarly publishing. And it's got this sort of built-in capacity for dialogue.
Yeah, I heard, I can't remember where I heard or saw this, but someone said that you've got to learn when to talk and when to pass the mic. And I think for me, especially now that I'm starting to do podcasting as a collaborative participatory thing a bit more, it's kind of given me opportunities and making me think about when to pass the mic. And I think it's been very useful in that way. I mean, it's undeniable that when you make a podcast, you are in charge and you get to choose what goes on it and what doesn't. But you also have more opportunities to bring in other voices than you might if you were writing a journal article, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. This makes me think sort of, Merle, what you were saying about starting a podcast in the context of the pandemic and sort of this opportunity to see maybe in a new way how your research is like incredibly timely and incredibly of the moment. And there's a different, like, I suspect that can be a little more challenging to figure out how to like engage community and dialogue around like 700 AD and what was up.
Yeah, no, I agree, first of all, with everything you just said and what Sadie just said about engaging different people, outside your normal group. I mean, as I said, I had no plan at the start whatsoever, other than be given a couple crash points on how to do it and knowing what type of podcast I liked, which was, kind of friendly banter, two hosts making fun of each other constantly. Like my go-to way back in the day and still is the Men in Blazers podcast, which is two English guys talking about soccer in America. And they're very like friendly banter. But what I'll say is I guess to compliment what Sadie said, but to look at the other side. And I thought about this for a while because I said I had no plan. Now that I'm admitting this on being recorded, so everything I'm going to say is, of course, apocryphal and what I'll claim in 10 years. But what I think that, at least from my perspective, from a pure scholarly, what does it do for your scholarship, is, anyone who does exams, comprehensive exams in North America has some form of, whiplash, PTSD, whatever you want to call it, from doing your exams, I think, right? Because you're just reading so much stuff constantly that you don't know what to do with. And I actually think running a scholarly podcast is actually that, but in a much healthier way. Because, right, when you bring any guest on, if you want to ask them questions, you have to read something of theirs, right? 2, 3 things, whatever it might be. So you read 2 or 3 things on something you don't know at all, and you try to figure it out, give out questions, and have a cogent conversation with someone about it. So what you actually get, I think, from this process is kind of what Sadie was saying, although if you want to look just inwardly academically, rather than, I completely agree on the outward facing stuff, you actually learn a whole new field or part of a field really quickly. Right. And so what it then allows you to do, and what I've been able to do in my own, serious scholarship, or whatever you want to call it, peer-reviewed journal work, is you can take the perspectives of a field that's asked similar questions or different questions, might be like 50 years ahead of your own field in terms of like what it's doing, the questions it's asking, and just bring that to your own work. Right. That's like the fundamental thing that I think is really valuable, is I've learned whole new time periods. Right. We had someone on recently talked about 20th century American healthcare. Right. And so the questions they're asking is obviously radically different than 700 CE, for example. But, they do have really interesting questions. So I think that's ultimately the value as a scholar, if you want to do pure academic work, is you're asking whole new questions and learning whole new fields.
Yeah, I love that. It's got this sort of almost dilettantish interdisciplinarity to it. That like podcasting, you can just be like, I don't know, I'm just going to have somebody on who knows about this other thing and talk to them and learn about them. And that can be hard to do when you're usually at like the same conferences with the same people and hearing the same conversations.
Can I jump in on that? Because that really resonates with me. And maybe it was because I started my podcast just as I was starting my PhD. I felt like I didn't want to and couldn't sort of position myself as like an equal expert with my guests. And so instead I embraced being the person who knows less and really built that into the kind of the conversation style and the strategies that we kind of plan ahead of time. And so it was really kind of resonating with me what Merle and Sadie were saying about sort of the value of these conversations between people who know more about a topic and know less about a topic. And actually, as the person who, consistently knows less about the topic than the people I'm talking with, I feel like that's really valuable for me. Obviously, I learn a lot, but I think there is also a kind of distinctive kind of knowledge that is produced in those conversations. And so to record them and put them out into the world, I think that each of my guests is in no other context really going to kind of explain their work in the way that they explain it to me. And so I think that's really valuable, especially from an accessibility standpoint, that people outside of universities, people who don't know anything about that discipline, can access that person's ideas and their research in a way that they don't really have other points of access to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole sort of kernel in what you've been describing there, Milan, of like both the kind of humility that becomes possible when we make podcasts, which really decenters the kind of academic as expert talking head, like being willing to be a person who like doesn't know and is learning stuff in public, but also the like fundamentally pedagogical drive of what we do on podcasts. And I think I'm noting John's comment in the chat here about, you know, convincing other people that podcasters are not being dilettantes. And I'm kind of like, I love being a dilettante. I'm really into amateurism. Like I find expertise a much less rich position to occupy personally, but that is, you know, the idea of the importance of teaching and learning, of talking and listening, like those are so devalued in academia as compared to expertise and like traditional outputs, partially because we devalue teaching remarkably in these teaching institutions, that it's often considered to be the less important thing that we're doing. And podcasting often feels to me like it is making an argument for our work needing to always be a little bit pedagogical.
Can I ask you then, because you know you've had your podcast peer reviewed and that was such a kind of pioneering thing, how do you feel about the kind of, you know, the expertise contained in that podcast and kind of making that legible to a scholarly peer review? I
mean, the great thing and what I really realized through the process of having Secret Feminist Agenda peer reviewed is that I think for a lot of early career scholars, we get used to experiencing peer review as a form of gatekeeping, where we have to prove the legitimacy of our ideas through a series of sort of conservative gestures that like root our ideas in like the canon of thinkers. But the thing is that like, if you want to push boundaries, chances are there are other academics who also want to push boundaries, and good presses, which is one of the reasons it was a really good idea, I think, to work with an academic press for this, is that they have really solid experience seeking out appropriate scholars to peer review projects, right? They don't just like go and find like they find people who will understand what the project is doing. And so the people who peer reviewed my work were feminist scholars interested in public scholarship, interested in new media, digital life writing, who understood what the podcast was doing. And in that sense, it shifted my understanding of what their expertise was accomplishing, because I realized there is a lot of value in other people who have read the same stuff I have and have been thinking about the same questions I have, richly and thoroughly engaging with my podcast to sort of give it this holistic response. And that at no point was it them being like, you didn't cite this person, so this isn't scholarship, right? It was much more like, oh, it's interesting what you're doing here is engaging with the concept of the anecdote. I would love to hear you think a little bit more about this person's scholarship on feminist anecdotes. Like they sort of got it. But it reminded me that like sometimes expertise feels like gatekeeping, and sometimes expertise is being positioned within a particular conversation in a particular way. And that is part of what makes the dialogue piece of podcasts so exciting, is that sometimes you want to talk to people who are positioned in the same conversation as you so that you can really go deep in the minutia of that conversation. And sometimes you really want to talk to people who are positioned in totally different conversations so that you can find those unexpected lateral connections. I have both. Emanuele, I'm really interested in bringing in the point that you made about your new podcast and the idea of using it to connect back home. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that connection, particularly in the context of making like an Italian language podcast.
Okay, the connection is this idea of connecting through the podcast was related to the observation that I did when I was doing hosting the first podcast on the Nile, that whenever I was asking colleagues, journalists to be host, to be guest in the podcast, they were always delighted and super happy. And it was indeed really a way of inviting people to, as guests in your podcast, was indeed really a way of, I think, acknowledging expertise, knowledge, and roles and work that has been done. And people were happy. And so after the podcast, after recording the podcast, there was always follow-up in terms of exchange, email or meetings that we could have. So indeed, it was not only, I find it a relational medium, in spite of being a one-to-one conversation, most of the way it is technically conceived and made. But indeed, I think in our case, especially the Nile podcast, really enable us to nurture a community of practice and interest around this idea of, okay, which role as journalists, media practitioner can we play in water conflict and cooperation? And so with the podcast on the Italian water movement, again, for me was a way to, first of all, also after not having been, I spent almost a year here in the Netherlands without having the opportunity to go back to Italy. And that was also emotionally quite hard for the whole family. So it was a way to be closer, also by using a different medium of expression, my mother tongue Italian, and not instead of English. And it was a way also indeed to try to reconnect with people, with activists with whom I used to work in the past. So that was how I think. And if I may, I would also like to throw a second point, which I think I really I find quite important, because doing podcasts for me, at least, has helped me to become more reflexive in my practice as researcher. And being trained as a political scientist, I think of voice not only from the technical point of view, but also as a political act. And so when I was editing the podcast and the interviews, I was a bit scared, because it's very easy you can manipulate easily what people say. And so drawing and finding a balance between the authenticity of your interview and the fact of making your podcast something that is not too long, that sounds nice also, and your editorial choices in terms of giving and taking out voices, indeed is a political act. And so I became much more aware of this. And even if now when I'm quoting on a paper, it's something that I ask myself, okay, but how and why this sentence and why not the full sentence, and how do you contextualize it? So I think this idea of editing as a political act is something that helped me to become more reflexive in my research.
Yeah, I love that idea of reflexivity sort of connects, I think, to a larger conversation we sort of started on email about the way that podcasting reveals the conditions of production of our knowledge, that a lot of the time sort of the way things get made is obscured by the familiarity of those processes, and that when you move into a different medium, you think maybe a little differently about a process like editing, like selecting interviewees, like how you're gonna format your conversation, like in the case of Katherine, like how are you going to choose the archival clips that you are going to talk about, and what is the role that sort of that kind of self-reflexivity plays? I feel like in Shortcuts, self-reflexivity is a really important part of the project that you're doing.
Yeah, and actually I was thinking about that in relation to what Emanuele was just saying about the potential for podcasts to connect as well. Also, it did make me think about, no wonder it's a little, I often feel like I'm having to somehow assume the role of expertise when I'm talking to an archival recording, because it can't necessarily talk to me. Or can't have a chat with the archival recording. But I've noticed that I've really enjoyed bringing people on to just have a chat about the recording then, and so then you can kind of step away, because I'm not the expert on many of these poets, but perhaps my expertise is in archival listening and like thinking about the questions you can ask and paying attention to particular moments. So, going back to the comprehensive exam metaphor as well, that I came to this after completing my PhD. So it was a time when I was exploring and continue to be exploring sound studies as something that, my PhD was on poetry and performance, but this is stepping out into a different field. And so it's been a place to sort of step away from being an expert and think, okay, what am I listening to? What catches my attention? How can we think about the fact that even just the pure selection of the archival clip is already making an editorial choice, and how do I foreground that in shortcuts and really draw attention to the selection and what we're listening to as being really very much part of the listening experience. It also makes me think about how this, making connections, you can make connections in the present with archives of the past. So in one of the examples or that Hannah shared in advance with us, brought me back to the shortcuts actually called Connections, when the Muriel Rukeyser Archives Project got in touch with me because of listening to the podcast. And it was one of those great moments when it felt like Muriel Rukeyser was like coming back to be like, yes, I like this clip. I'm gonna click like on this, and it ended up being a really generative connection with their archives and bringing new sounds to their research. So you can have these moments of real literal connection through the making of the podcast. That is a great reminder that what you're doing this very publicly. People are listening, and that is so different than writing an academic article that often feels like a very silent and solitary experience. What I will say with that, though, is just last point on this, is that the podcasting has made me realize that we need to rethink what we think of as sort of the output final endpoint, because so often we think about, okay, we're going to do this and then we're going to write an article. But what if we think, well, maybe we make a podcast episode and it might lead to maybe 5 different things. We might be interviewed here. We might write a collaborative article, which I've done as a result of 2 different episodes, and it might lead to all these different things. And none of those things are the final endpoints, but they're this like rhizomatic series of things created through sound and through listening. So I think podcasting is really great in reminding us that, oh yeah, like these are the things we can make with it. It's not just about making one particular kind of output.
Yeah.
Can
yeah, of course.
Sorry, I just want to jump in and reinforce that from my experience, often asking scholars, we see on their faculty pages that they have a book in progress, and we ask if they want to talk about it, and they say, well, no, not really until the book is finished. And I really want to echo, Katherine, what you've been saying, because I also just think there's something, like when we think about like the kind of the temporality of research, like how fantastic would it be to have a record of like someone's thinking halfway through the project or right at the start? I think that's not something that scholars, are trained to value, but I think it's wonderful. And I'm so happy when people are like, well, I've got this new thing that I'm just starting to think about. Could we talk about that? That for me is really exciting.
Yeah, I agree entirely. That sort of transparency of process. Emanuele, I feel like you were
because actually that was exactly one of the reasons, the temporality was exactly one of the reasons we started the Nile podcast. We were working with journalists, and in our meetings, we were always sharing, discussing ideas, and the journalists were saying, okay, but can we quote you on this? And say, we are still working on the paper, we need to publish it. And so we said, let's record all this in the podcast, that at least you can refer to that, and that's immediate.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of really interesting thinking happening in the chat here too about like capturing process and destabilizing the like final output, or the idea that a podcast should only be a mobilization of research that is already completed. Katherine.
Yeah, so because so often it's actually, even this conversation, like it's because of the ideas unfolding in time in relation to each other that we emerge at something, and the podcast allows for the sounding of that and listening to that, and that can also be quite scary because we are more vulnerable. We're thinking on our feet, we're thinking out loud, but that's really the way that process can be captured in some way, or and then a listener can unfollow and see and understand the process and not just hear, the thing we arrived at. But it's much more interesting to listen to the process. It's messier, but it has the asides, it has the sort of footnotes spoken into it. And it really gives a sense of where the ideas came from and the voices through which they were spoken to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I keep thinking too of that conversation we started on email about temporality, because we're thinking about temporality in a lot of ways here, including the sort of temporality of scholarship. What comes first? What comes later? Why is podcasting a great way to like get stuff out faster? When journalists don't want to sit around and wait for 3 years for that article to be peer reviewed and be quotable somewhere. But also a point that Milan made, which is podcasting sure does take a lot of time, huh? And that's one of the things that like it's an undeniable material reality of working in this medium, that it is time consuming, and that can be productive because it can sort of remind us that making intellectual work is labor, and that there are useful ways to think about it as taking up time, but it can also be really hard to manage. We have
and just to say about that, like so my podcast episodes are extremely short. They're like 15 minutes each. About 30 to 40 hours of labor we've estimated go into that. Like I work with a team of 4, but there's a kind of tension that we feel between making this very small, self-contained, accessible piece of audio that it shouldn't feel like a lot of work has gone into it, but then also wanting to make the kind of the labor and the thinking and the process visible to people that want to know how it gets made.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a thing that conventional articles are not good at. That labor is so obscured, often for the very people who are publishing in those ecosystems. But podcasting makes that labor so much more visible, both to us and to other people who might be interested in our work. Though I'm amazed to hear 40 hours, your podcast must be very professionally made.
I don't know about professional, but yeah, it's labor intensive, put it that way.
That makes me think that I think our panel, it's the questions that we're asking too is so interestingly positioned between, say, not to put them on two sides, but the scholarly and the commercial, and thinking like, even thinking of like, are we making podcasts that sound professionally made, and what is the labor involved in that? What is the labor involved in promoting the podcast? And then thinking, oh wait, we're also making sure that this podcast is scholarly and and there's all kinds of labor that then is involved there, and thinking that we're trying to do both, and that's very hard. and thinking that if we sort of, even to choose one involves a lot of labor, but we're actually trying to somehow manage both. And I'm interested in thinking, especially like Sadie, I was so impressed, like the website for your podcast and all of the labor that's gone into teaching resources and everything. It's very well presented, and I'm interested to hear about the work, like how sustainable, beyond this, and what advice would you give for making that happen?
Very good question. I'm probably a terrible person to give advice on it, because I don't know how sustainable the way that I do the podcast is. I put the number of hours I put in compared to the number of hours I put out in terms of audio is like ridiculous. Like, but that's kind of what I love as well. Like, I love working slowly, and I love spending a really long time editing a short piece of audio. And so like I won a prize well, not that recently, like a year ago. But part of the prize was that I got like mentorship from a company called Steady, who kind of they're setting themselves up as kind of the European version of Patreon. And all of their advice was that in order to grow and develop my podcast, I needed to start churning out content faster. And I just kind of didn't really take the advice, because I just like working really slowly. And I like making stuff that I think is good. And I think making good podcasts does take a lot of time. And there are different ways to do podcasts as well. Like, some are more labor intensive than others. But I think that if people want to do it the non-efficient way, then that's great. But yeah, it's really tricky. And I have been thinking about how I'm gonna, I suppose part of the reason I've been putting in this grant application to make podcasting more integrated into my work that I get paid for, and my kind of what's recognized as my scholarly output, is that at the moment I just make the podcast mostly in my spare time, and it's not part of my day job, and it's not what I'm paid for. And that's probably not very sustainable. I think if I'm going to keep podcasting, I need to make it part of my day job. I think that's what I'm saying. So yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I don't really have any good answers. I'm not very good at kind of streamlining how I do it. I don't know if other people have any advice for me.
I wonder, Merle, because you've been making a regular, is it regular? Is your podcast like comes out on a schedule?
Yeah, I mean, we were weekly every week from, March, let's just say March 30th, with the exception, I think, the week of Christmas 2020, all the way through about a month ago. And then we slowed down to every other week. I mean, again, because we're a chatty podcast, right? We have a sound editor. We've got a small grant for that. And so that, we could clean it up. So it wasn't like, we could make edits here and there. Nothing like removing, but just like, someone misspeaks or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it was very time intensive. I'll just say this, and I know we probably want to leave some room for audience questions as well. Having said that, I had no idea what I was doing. I would say, if you want to do this, and it sounds like Sadie's approaching this in a really smart way, come up with at some point what your own strategic plans are, right? So it sounds like, as I said, Sadie's doing this in a smart way, bake this into her actual work that quote unquote counts. And I would say for me, right, how I've been thinking about this is, as I said, learning different fields and then going out and doing research, and that is more quote unquote standard, whatever that means. And we can agree or disagree with that. But, and I think probably in a few years, or we'll see how long, podcasting will become more accepted as a medium. I do believe that, but, that doesn't help people immediately. So you do have to have a strategic plan for what you personally want to get out of it. And as I said, for me, it's about bringing that research back to my own stuff.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of strategic plans, can I ask Stacey to drop a link to the guidebook in? Stacey Copeland, who is in the audience, and I worked on a guidebook for academic podcasting, and included in it is a lot of those, like, figure out how often you're going to release, figure out how much work your genre is going to take, figure out what kind of budget you have. Like, those are the practical considerations that I too, as a brand new podcaster, absolutely did not think about, and then committed to a weekly podcast, and that was so sad. All right, we've got 6 minutes, and I would love to hear some questions, and I already see Pella Felton has their hand up.
Hi. So one of the conversations that we've been having this morning has sort of been about, like, what types of podcasts have scholarly value. And it, like, I was thinking a lot about the Chatcast, which, like, And I would consider Which Please to be some sort of a hybrid between a more traditional and like the chat cast, but it is definitely using the conversation as the source for scholarship. And I was sort of thinking about how that erases a lot of the barriers that go into podcasting, because producing something as great as something like StoryWeb, which is brilliant, and I tear up at a lot of the episodes. Also, it's very labor intensive. And for a lot of scholars, a lot of us who are graduate students who are maybe working 2 or 3 assistantships, we don't have the luxury of being able to sit and edit these things. So for us, something like a more informal discussion, and even within those informal discussions, you could just say, hey, well, have you read X and Y? Have you read Stacy Copeland's piece on the heart? And then you can use that as sort of like a more quotidian citation. And so I wonder how we sort of like take away some of the stigma of like a conversation between 2 people can be scholarship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is like expanding the tent of what constitutes a scholarly podcast, which is a really important part of that conversation. There's a really interesting, Mac Haygood, who I believe is also in the audience, has a really great recent piece on the state of scholarly podcasting, about like the sort of low res versus high res history of like the sort of Radiolab-esque podcast versus what academics tend to make, which is like me and my iPhone in a basement somewhere, and like how we can sort of make space for slightly higher res production within academic work. And at the same time, I think maintaining space for like just real janky amateur audio production is also really important, because amateurism is a really important part of the medium history of podcasting.
Yeah, and I one of the things that I think I noticed in Which Please, and it's part of this new movement of chatcasts, things like You're Wrong About and Maintenance Phase, which are using a structure that's really like embracing sort of like feminist spectatorship and talking back, the idea of the ability to talk back at a text and resist a text, and like almost very Dolan-esque approach to discourse. And I think that in something like that becomes like more structured, like Radiolab, there is an ultimate pull to get to an imagined public that's a very much like this imaginary public, where like I feel like one of the things the Chatcast does is creates a very real public, and a presence of a counter public, or maybe even just like a public that doesn't look the way. And that's one of the things that I just absolutely appreciate about what the work that you're doing, and also and why I think we need to re-examine like the value of just talking to each other.
Yeah. Speaking of which, any other thoughts about chatcasts from our panel, our roundtable? So I'm going to take up then. Oh,
sorry, not directly on chatcast, but on this on the question that was asked by Pela, which are the most scholarly type of podcast? I don't think there is a type of podcast which is more scholarly than another. But I think that if we want to make and to legitimate your podcast as a scholarly object, the only way of doing it, or maybe at least the way I would do it, is to treat it as a scholarly object. So quote it in articles as a source of knowledge, data, empirical data. Quote it in your methodology if it's part of your methodology in your research. Use it as an educational tool, especially nowadays in times of online digital education. I find it a very interesting tool to flip the classroom. So all these, and it's a practice. And the most we do it, I hope, the most we will convince people about the legitimacy of this medium.
Yeah, we're gonna have to end things here. I feel like we could talk for another hour at least about these topics. I also wanna say that we've got a video from Alex Helberg, who wasn't able to join us, that maybe can also be shared as part of this recording, and Dario Llinares also sends his regrets.
Hi there, everybody. So sorry that I couldn't be with you today, but I hope that that you're able to get this and include it as part of the roundtable, because I'd love to participate, even if it has to be from a virtual standpoint here. So my name is Alex Helberg. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Trinity College in the Writing and Rhetoric department here, and I'm the co-host and co-executive producer of the Rhetoric and Cultural Studies podcast Reverb, which brings humanities concepts and perspectives to bear on pressing political and cultural issues, both contemporary and historical. We also are big fans of puns. That's why our podcast is about politics, culture, language, and action, and our name is RE:VERB. So for those of you who are also pun fans, that's a little something for you. Being a podcaster, I would say, has totally transformed my relationship to scholarship. I can't really imagine doing it any other way at this point. Particularly in the way that it helps us connect our work with more practical stakes than we typically might associate with other kinds of academic work, and really getting our work out to engaged audiences, right? One of the biggest things that has kind of come as a shock to me is getting, even though it's not, anywhere near big popular podcasts, our shows are still getting more views than most academic journal articles get in their entire lifespan, and we can end up getting those in like a couple of months. Maybe some of you have had that too, which is kind of cool to see that it's actually having a little bit more broad circulation. And also, just in general, I think it's good for just the public humanities in general to try and get our ideas out there in accessible formats that multiple different kinds of people could have access to now in ways that they otherwise couldn't. So in terms of the significant barriers to scholarly podcasting right now, I would say that probably the biggest one, maybe this is self-evident, I'm sure that others have brought it up, is tech literacy in general, being able to actually learn to use equipment and audio editing software obviously takes time. A lot of times it takes money, or you have to already have some institutional clout. I know I was fortunate as a graduate student, and my colleagues and I started this podcast at Carnegie Mellon University. We were able to actually get some seed money from our department, as well as organizational funds from the university itself, to be able to pay for things like this microphone that I'm speaking into right now, or some of our other audio software. So obviously, having that kind of money on hand to be able to do this kind of thing is not something that's available to everybody. But at the same time, by that same token, I also think that creating podcasts is becoming quickly one of the more accessible forms of doing digital scholarship, especially since freeware creation tools like Audacity and other methods of capturing audio. I mean, you could even do it from a webcam or record it onto a smartphone if you have one of those. It's becoming more and more accessible by the day. So I think in general, I don't think it's probably going to eclipse journal publications, but it certainly is a way of making this scholarship more accessible. And to that last question, how do we stop academe from absorbing podcasts as just another output or metric, and thus sucking all the joy out of them? I am definitely not for sucking the joy out of podcasts, but I do want to just push back on maybe the premise of that question a little bit, just because I still believe that a podcast can serve as an output or a metric for scholarly production, say if you're trying to put together a tenure case, for example, and it doesn't have to necessarily mean that it sucks the joy out of it, right? I mean, you can still have fun doing something like this and still have it actually count as legitimate scholarship. In fact, I would actually argue that I'd appreciate seeing podcasts become more officially recognized as scholarship in and of itself. for building tenure cases or CV lines for job applications and things like that, because this would actually be a way of deriving significant material value or attributing material value for what is in reality some very difficult academic labor. As many of us have mentioned, this whole venture is not exactly easy. But I also want to emphasize that we shouldn't merely quantify the number of podcasts that we've produced as markers of the significance of this kind of scholarship. I would argue, maybe it's just because this is my theoretical training, in order to develop a more robust appreciation for scholarship for podcasts as scholarship, I think we would need to look towards the way that our work circulates within certain publics, whether they be academic or non-academic social circles. And there are some very interesting ways to do that. And I want to just end here by sharing one of those with you. I've discovered a kind of sneaky way that I can find out how many institutions and classes within them are actually using our podcast episodes in their courses by looking at web traffic sources in the back end of our hosting platform, which in our case is Squarespace. So what this ultimately shows is that podcasts, whether or not we consider them as scholarship, are being used as scholarship. They are influencing the ways that people teach, that people maybe talk about these concepts, and even the way that we're citing different materials, right? I'd be very curious to hear other thoughts from my roundtable co-participants, but I just want to show you a quick screen share here from, this is from the back end of our Squarespace website, where we're looking at traffic sources. You can actually see from the referral links here, we're getting things from like Colorado State's Instructure platform. Let's see, Isidore at the University of Dayton, Georgia State, something's coming from there, and Instructure site from University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, right? All sorts of different places, Kennesaw, University of Maryland, Penn State University, all sorts of different places that people are finding our work, specifically if they have something like Instructure or D2L or Moodle or something like that in front of them, can tell us that our scholarship is actually being taken up and circulated by at least these classroom publics. So I would be very curious to hear from others if there are other ways that you've been able to account for this kind of circulation, and how we might make some good arguments for considering podcasts as real academic labor and as real scholarship. Thank you all very much. It was great getting to talk to you. Hopefully we'll get to talk to some more of you very soon.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to everybody for your questions. I hope the chat can get saved as well, because the chat was wonderful. And I'm going to say goodbye to everybody as we all head off to the keynote.